Okay, it's about just, what is it, 1 minute past 4. I'll start introducing our speaker and our talk today very slowly. Yeah, welcome everybody to the second talk in our series on the critical citizen, hosted by the Language, Literature and Politics research group at the Open University. The first week we started off with a talk by Tim Christians on the intersecting debates on the gig economy and citizenship, which will go up as a recording in the next couple of weeks if you want to catch up on that. But today's talk is by Professor Engin Isin, until very recently professor in the politics and international relations at Queen Mary University in London. And his talk is on the conditions of planetary citizenship. Just to introduce Engin briefly, actually, just before I do that, a couple of protocols. Just the request is, in fact, all of you have done this already, is to mute your microphones and turn off your cameras during the talk. So we'll just have Engin on screen during the talk. As the talk proceeds, feel free to type questions into the chat box, or you can wait until the talk finishes. I'll keep a close eye on the chat box, and then I'll ask you to speak to those questions once Engin's finished. And then just to let you know, the talk will be recorded, only the talk, not the question and answer session, and that will go up on the website in a couple of weeks' time. Very briefly to introduce Engin, just about his education. He did a BA at the Middle East Technical University in Turkey, an MA at the University of Waterloo, and a PhD at Toronto University. And then he's had a really interesting working life. He was Professor of Social Science and Canada Research Chair at York University in Canada. He was then Professor of Politics at the Open University for about 10 years, 2007 to 2016, and most recently Professor of International Politics at Queen Mary. Engin's published incredibly widely on citizenship, and I'll just run through some of his major books and edited collections, which are a tremendous introduction, but then also a kind of amazingly wide-ranging guide to the debates on citizenship. His first book was Cities Without Citizens, Modernity of the City as a Corporation in 1992. In 2002, he published Being Political, Genealogies of Citizenship. He edited with Brian Turner the Handbook of Citizen Studies for SAGE in 2002 as well. It's an incredibly, one on my shelf, an incredibly useful guide, remains so. He edited with Greg Nielsen, Acts of Citizenship, published by Z Books in 2008. And the final essay by Engin in that collection, called Theorizing Acts of Citizenship, is one, again, I've found very useful. A book in 2012 called Citizens Without Frontiers, published by Bloomsbury. A co-edited book with Evelyn Rupert called Being Digital Citizens in 2015. And you can see as Engin's career and publications have proceeded, he's been very much at the cutting edge of debates about citizenship. Then edited a collection called Citizenship After Orientalism, Transforming Political Theory in 2015. And again, he's got a really nice essay there called Citizenship's Empire, which I'd recommend. And finally, maybe the most enduring legacy, I don't know how Engin would look back on his career, but he's also the chief editor of Citizenship Studies, a journal which started in 1997. And I actually this morning looked back at his essay on that, which was called "Who is the New Citizen Towards a Genealogy." And I was thinking that's kind of from 1997 to 2023. We're now thinking about a critical citizen. We're trying to still, wrestle with the content of what a citizen is. The final point in the introduction, I just wanted to mention, Engin has got a really fantastic website, which I'm just going to paste into the chat box here, which I'd recommend. There it goes. Which is a collection of many of his publications and gives you the range of his interests. And I was looking at it over the weekend, And our group is called Language, Literature and Politics. And looking at Engin's CV, it looks very much as if he belongs in the sort of politics and I suppose language department. But I was very heartened to see on the opening page a substantial quote from W.H. Auden's poem, The Unknown Citizen from 1940. So, which in a very compressed and powerful fashion compresses, kind of captures many of the debates and things we wrestle with about the content of what a citizen is. So without, you've come to listen to Engin, not to me. I'll hand over to him now, and then I'll keep an eye on the chat box for your questions and talk to you again later.
Okay, thanks very much, David. Thanks very much for that introduction. I'm really pleased to be here figuratively at the Open University. As David mentioned, I've had 10 years, 10 wonderful years at the Open University. And it's nice to be back in this way, although I have been back as well in person before the pandemic. David, thanks also mentioning my website as well as the citizenship studies. Just recently, we have celebrated the 25th year, and we have edited a collection of 40 essays. And I think it's one of the sort of really most comprehensive compendiums on where we are at with citizenship today. So let me get to the today's topic, the conditions of planetary citizenship. I'd like to start by saying that this is an early report on ongoing work. I'm really interested in your response. This is really an invitation to think together this coupling planetary citizenship as a concept and what it can do for the idea of a critical citizen. Now, when I used the first time in a couple of occasions this couple planetary citizenship, the response indicated to me that it's immediately compared to other possible variants, such as transnational citizenship, cosmopolitan citizenship, international citizenship, global citizenship, world citizenship. Each is a kind of citizenship that regards the constraints imposed on citizenship by the nation state form, the political form, needs to be expanded. And then there are a variety of practices that go beyond the articulations of nation state, but nation state still remains the dominant home of citizenship. Of course, planetary citizenship, in a way, contributes to and starts from these forms of discussions and practices of beyond the nation state. But also, I think there is something different about it. It provokes and evokes something different about citizenship. And today, really, I want to open that up and see the possibilities or what it might provide. Now, the key difference that I want to set out at the outset between planetary citizenship and the other forms of citizenship that I just mentioned, that planetary is not a geographic scale. I don't want to consider it as a geographic scale, as in world citizenship, cosmopolitan citizenship, international citizenship, indicating already a territorialized space in which a particular form of membership or belonging holds with its rights and responsibilities. I want to also not consider the planetary as merely a historical period, age, era, epoch, as if to onset of a new era, the planetary age, by linking its genealogy to older forms, not suggesting that planetary is not offering some new openings, but also it has very, very old genealogies that we need to connect back to. Then when I was doing this work, I was presented with a conceptual and methodological issue of without having to define the planetary, the condition in which we find ourselves, as it were, in the present, without giving a definition, what kind of concept would I work with to consider it? It is, for example, it is not um, it is not necessarily describable merely by appealing to various facts about the condition, because those facts can be organized differently and presented differently. I eventually settled on something that I want to share with you and elaborate on, but not necessarily fully defend why that particular category that is important to me. I want to consider the planetary as a socially instituted imaginary. I will explain what I mean by socially instituted imaginary. Um, but by doing so, the planetary citizenship, what the socially instituted imaginary, what it allows me, that I'm not necessarily thinking about this concept as displacing, replacing, or even substituting other variants. That is not the issue. That is not the aim of these considerations or my reflections on it. It is not about opposed to cosmopolitan citizenship, opposed to world citizenship, global citizenship, not even in comparison terms underlying something that they don't accomplish, but planetary citizenship might accomplish. Instead, I want just to draw a radical breach between those forms and what planetary citizenship brings us together as a socially instituted imaginary of the planetary. Um, Now, this ongoing work involved developing about 12 propositions about the planetary movements in general. I cannot discuss them all today. I'll be giving 4 lectures in the next few months, and I will discuss roughly 3 propositions in each. Once the cycle is over, I hope I will be in a better place in terms of articulating this concept. So this is an overview and a glimpse of some of the ideas that went into constituting planetary citizenship. Now, let me say a few things about the social institution of imaginary that I have used already. What is an imaginary? First, it is not ideology. An imaginary is not episteme, imagination, or any of the fictionary connotations that the word might um, indicate. It is not myth, it's not fantasy, it's not illusion. An imaginary is a socially instituted description through which we organize collective will, collective force, as political and social force, knowledges, ways of knowing about the objects and aims of um, organizing our will, and respond to questions of how we live our lives. So when I say socially instituted imaginary, I mean to say not something fictitious and imagined, but something that provides an attunement for us to organize our wills, knowledges, and ways of responding to how do I live in ways that materializes various concepts. So it is not an idealist concept, but it's a materialist concept in that sense. Now, how are imaginaries socially instituted? I already mentioned 3 categories that I work with: organizational will, knowledge, and acts. I'm going to add 2 more: habitus and habitat. Institutional social imaginaries or social institution of imaginaries not only involve organizing a will, knowledge, and action, but also produces a particular body comportment and disposition, embodied ways of being in the world that over a fairly long period of time we inhabit. So habitus is an important part of also the institution of social imaginary. Each socially instituted imaginary portrays and builds itself in our bodies. Gender is a good example. Masculinity and femininity We embody that over a long period of time, but we don't necessarily find ourselves already housed in them. Habitat also is another aspect of the social institution of imaginaries, in the sense that each socially instituted imaginary also constitute material practical spaces through which and in which we live our lives, order our lives, constitute our lives. These are really important aspects of understanding that how I want to approach the planetary as a socially instituted imaginary, because I want to see how will knowledge and acts are organized, what kinds of habits we are being interpolated into or invited to, as well as the kinds of habitat that envisages. Without doing this work, I do feel that investing myself in the concept of the planetary is not a good way of going about facing the planetary. This work of what forces are producing this imaginary, how it is socially instituting it, are the questions that I need to answer. Now, of course, planetary is not the only imaginary that is in circulation. If I already mentioned internationalism, cosmopolitanism, globalism, transnationalism, these movements also socially institute imaginaries and provoke, seduce, invite, gather, or coerce people into their persuasive structures. They are also an ongoing circulating movements that institute imaginaries. But these are not the only movements either. We have to consider, for example, fascism, racism, capitalism, colonialism, imperialism. These movements also have come to socially institute imaginaries into which organized wills, forms of knowledge, and action, as well as a particular habitus and habitat associated with them. The imaginary of the white supremacy, for example, that the white is a color that identifies superiority as part of racist imaginary, is socially instituted over a very long period of time. And I consider even capitalism and colonialism as such without movements without socially instituted imaginaries would not really function. So the question that then emerges is that in what sense that planetary movements can be differentiated from these movements? What is the key beyond not being a geographical scale or a historical period, as I mentioned earlier? What is the key differentiation of planetary movements in their interpolation, in their invitation to order our lives or respond to it? Um, we could, of course, talk about, well, planetary, of course, is about climate change, the extreme weather, all the effects of us inhabiting the world and the consequences that we are experiencing, changes in biosphere, hydrosphere, and atmosphere, all the things that we have come to learn about and react to in the last 10, 20 years. But in this 10 or 20 years, one word particularly and one concept particularly has captured the imagination of many people, and that's Anthropocene. And I think it is worth thinking about what Anthropocene signifies. Of course, there's been a huge debate about Anthropocene, what it signifies and what it interpolates and so on. But I'm going to mention something that is particularly pertinent for developing the idea of planetary citizenship. Now, the Anthropocene, as the period, proposed geological period name for the condition in which we find ourselves, where as species, as human species, our impact on the planet and its condition has now reached a certain level where one of the species of the Earth planet has now had such an impact on the planet itself that the planet can no longer be seen as a background and a resource to human activities, but deeply implicated in these human activities. That we must actually change ourselves to be able to capture and captivate some of the processes that we set in place through extractivism, resource exploitation, and so on. So Anthropocene, defined that way, invites us to think about ourselves also as a species differently. Planetary movements, those who invest themselves in the articulation of Anthropocene as the defining moment, and its variant versions. There are a number of words that have been proposed, but I'm not going to go into those. Planetary movements, I feel, that are planetary because they urge us as human species to resist seeing like the state, empire, or corporation, meaning only in terms of our history and our relationship with the planet from the point of view of social and political institutions that we have created. These social and political institutions are part of the history of the planet, but the planet has a deeper history and not merely as a background to the emergence, evolution, and the development of human species with their institutions. So Anthropocene invites us to think in much larger chunks of time and temporality than anything we have experienced before. Up until 40 years ago, for example, um, many scholars have talked and thought about the origins of political institutions going back 5,000 years, 6,000 years, the origins of cities, origins of states, origins of empires, have not even thought beyond that moment and writing other processes of the planet into the development of those institutions. If, in fact, the planet and its resources, planet and its other species, the plants and animals and rivers and mountains came into view in those origins stories, they were usually as a background and as a resource. But Anthropocene have started to change scholars' view of how to give a history of our own institutions, not against the background of the planet, but intermingled with the planet. And then they push the boundaries from just simply 5,000 and 6,000 years to Holocene, the entire Holocene, that is about 11,000 years. And in fact, Pleistocene, which goes back to 2.5 million years ago. The development of various species, biological organisms, all beings in the planet, and their eventual entanglements with human species became the story. Now, this simultaneously places human species in a predicament or interspecies solidarity for being the species having now had the decisive impact on this common habitat. Planetary movements are not neither merely about human species themselves alone, nor about the planet Earth itself, but the planet Earth as the common habitat of all planetary species. The responsibility and responsibilization of this realization clearly puts us in a position where we have to face the planetary condition. This is the difference between other movements and the planetary movements with all their entanglements that I have mentioned. Now I'm going to give examples of three propositions from my repertoire of 12, what I think are some of the elements of planetary imaginary instituted socially by various movements in terms of willing, knowing, and acting categories to get a better sense of the challenge that it poses for us to think about planetary condition and the notion of planetary citizenship. Now, in terms of organizing willing, and this is where I'm going to put probably the most significant difference between the planetary imaginary and other imaginaries in circulation. I think the planetary imaginary provokes and mobilizes an interspecies negotiation, a relationship with ourselves, with other peoples, with other species, and even with other planets, the scope which we have not experienced as thinking beings. Planetary imaginary discloses one significant condition, at least in the Holocene period, that have underwritten the development of human species. That is domination of peoples by peoples, species by species, planets by planets have been the condition of development in the last 15,000 years or so. Domination in the sense, for example, domestication of animals and plants, as well as domestication of people by people, the emergence of slavery, goes back to several thousand years. It's in that period that domination becomes the condition of the possibility of human so-called development, or even in some parlance, human civilizations. But those civilizations are marked by this underwritten assumption of domination of peoples by peoples, categorizing peoples into various categories, considering some of them being superior to the others, the emergence of slavery, emergence of institutions of tax tribute, domination of people and work, all that, as well as species by species, considering animals and plants as fair game for dominating for our own purposes, the human species. And I'm going to mention in a minute, even other planets. The planetary imaginary, I think, attunes us toward other planets in a significant way. Planetary movements make us recognize that they are movements within an interplanetary or interstellar space. The planet Earth we realize through the planetary imaginary that planet Earth does not have a monopoly on being a planet either. If planetary movements orient toward the planet Earth with care, this also places planetary species in relation to interplanetary and yet unknown species. If planetary movements disclose that humans have already had an impact on other planets, they reject colonization of space for military and corporate conquest. We already know the genocidal consequences of terra nullius, nobody's land on indigenous peoples around the world. We can only imagine catastrophic consequences of salus nullius, that is nobody's space. This is the outer space being open from space junk to satellites and military extractivism. Planetary movements resist, or planetary imaginary provokes us to resist, state, military, corporate colonization of outer space. This is a significant and radical proposition in terms of organization of our attunement and the scope of our thinking of the condition in which we find ourselves. Now, the second one that I want to mention is ways of knowing also change with planetary imaginary. The planetary imaginary organizes negotiated knowledges, arts, sciences, philosophies, religions. All conventions of truth-telling begin to stand in dialogue with each other rather than dominating one another. Truth-telling conventions such as sciences, arts, humanities, activism, journalism, and spirituality are such conventions that in dialogue with one another, producing, provoking, and participating in the production of planetary imaginary. The authority and legitimacy of a convention derives from how and under what condition its truth-telling reveals injustices suffered by domination of a people, a species, and a planet. And planetary imaginary forces us to think about the production of knowledge along the lines of domination, in which ways it participates in domination and of whom. Working out what and how to know and who can know is a dialogue between these conventions, always traversing justice and injustice. Planetary imaginaries understand that domination of one convention leads to domination of a people over another or species over another. And planetary imaginary makes us aware of the relationship between will to knowledge and will to power. This does not diminish the principle of objectivity for those who are in sciences, but it resignifies it. The principle of objectivity that characterizes truth-telling in sciences as planetary movements is not spectating, but acting through. This is the key reason for the elimination of the difference between nature and culture, which meant also elimination of the difference between natural sciences and human sciences. So we are reorganizing knowledge that have dominated our imaginers in the last at least 200 years, if not 500 years, if not 5,000 years, with the emergence of the planetary imaginary. But we are also organizing, and this is the third set of propositions that I'm developing, is the question of acting in the world, being active in the world, how the planetary is changing directly the ways in which we relate to not only the planetary imaginary, but the imaginaries that are associated with it. Planetary activism, if one might call, as variable intensities or provokes variable intensities. Planetary, imaginary, and movements ebb and flow in continuous but variable intensities. As movements, they generate restless intensities, but can vary these intensities, rest, evade, slow, and then quicken and intensify again in an ongoing, continuous manner. In that way, planetary movements are also transversal. They connect with and transform decolonial, indigenous, feminist, queer, ecological, migrant, anti-fascist, anti-imperialist, and anti-colonial movements. The planetary imaginary, by connecting, varying its intensities, what it opens up a space of negotiation between plants and animals, different species, and differently injustice peoples as well as species, and traverses them, connects them through various temporalities and spatialities. And that's one of the experiences that we are having where, for example, we could go to a demonstration about, let's say, a proposed legislation against retirement age changing, and then finding variously constituted people being in that protest, talking about the significance of connecting this to migrants movements, refugee movements, movements for animal rights, plants rights, and the climate change. These are traversing each other and learning from one another, developing a transversal front line that is planetary in scope. This is the gist of an overview of the propositions that I'm developing and the significance that the planetary makes in terms of thinking about political and social institutions, of which, of course, citizenship is one. Now, one question that one might ask, why connected with citizenship? Because citizenship, in some ways, as a concept, is related to some of the imperial, colonial, state-centric, nationalist movements and the nation state as the habitat of it, and why citizenship is being considered as planetary. Can't we find another actor, another agent, another named possibility for coupling with planetary citizenship? We can, and I'm open to suggestions, but I want to also resist the idea of associating citizenship necessarily with nationality and nation state citizenship, because citizenship has much longer history than the origins of nation state and nationality and the national constitution of political movements. In some ways, the thing that I want to say about citizenship is that citizenship is a revolutionary subject position against domination for emancipation. In each of what instances, if we write the genealogy of citizenship, we find that it's a revolutionary subject position that revolts against domination, asks questions about domination, just as we are now asking about the Anthropocene and the domination of humans, the planet Earth, and emancipation from those forms of domination. But it also gets fractured once it's instituted socially. Every form of citizenship begins to institute different forms of exclusion, repulsion, and expulsion from the remit of citizenship. It is a dynamic and tension that cannot be avoided, but also it gives it its potentiality, the promise of giving expression to that revolutionary subject position. And planetary citizenship does this in a particularly provocative way, because when you think about planetary citizenship, one of the things that it brings into being is that it is, by definition, without authorization. No one can appoint themselves to a position to identify who is and who is not a planetary citizen. Planetary citizenship is open for anyone who wants to perform it. Its performativity is radically open and cannot be delimited, and it cannot be converted into a citizenship like nationality. Therefore, it is both without authorization and without membership. But as a revolutionary subject position, planetary citizenship also opens up the identification of species, entities, beings that have never been considered and only recently being considered in a modest way, of living beings associated with it. We never thought of citizenship of plants. We didn't ever think of citizenship of mountains and rivers. We did consider citizenship of animals very recently, animal rights, and that's a spectacular example of the change that we are trying to articulate, we are trying to understand now. So the idea that, in fact, various living and non-living beings in the planet have agency, that have an also impact on other species, and that human species that are now entangled with these agencies, and that we have also the possibility and the potential to give voice to these agencies, more than voice, performativity and enactment on their regard. And then there's a certain militancy about the revolutionary subject position of planetary citizen, the kind of citizenship that we could not imagine until now, whose elements may have been in the making, now are in the form of articulability, that we can express them. An example of militancy, for example, scientific rebellion. Scientists are creating movements and considering themselves in revolt and rebellion for climate and against climate change. They are saying things like, for thousands of scientists, mostly older, privileged, moderate, to agree on something so apparently radical, which is the planetary imaginary, demonstrate the severity of the present moment. But the real radicals, they say, this is Scientist Rebellion website, but real radicals are in power. They will plunder the earth until it is but fire, and unless we stop them. And the amazing development is that we also see scientists doing direct action to be able to demonstrate their commitment to production of a planetary imaginary. I want to just stop by giving you an example of a another formation of a planetary citizenship, and how it traverses various registers and scales, and then it inhabits and presents itself in some unexpected ways. I'm not going to show you the picture, but I just took this picture just before this talk in my neighborhood. I noticed that the council has planted a tree and protected it around it. So it's a young tree. But unfortunately, the tree showed some signs of stress. When you look at it, is a tree surrounded by a cage, a protective cage, and then there's a note on it. You don't see and able to read the note from a distance, but when you get close, it says, "Are you thirsty? Me too. Please water me." And then there is a graphic image of a thirsty person who is in stress. A very interesting moment, because it's giving agency to the tree and making it speak to an authority who is supposed to actually provide nourishment for this tree, but clearly not. "Are you thirsty? Me too. Please water me," is the note on the tree. This is one of the examples of how we traverse um, the planetary imaginary and responding to various interpolations of that imaginary in our everyday lives. And of course, for me, when I see that image and the note, that is also a practice of, or an act of planetary citizenship. Okay, I'm going to stop at this point and open